On the morning of June 21st, 2026, in a quiet lecture hall in Bologna, Italy, a small group of scientists stood in front of a room full of journalists and made an announcement that would detonate across the internet within hours. Somewhere beneath the sands of the Giza Plateau, they claimed, sits a second Sphinx. Not a metaphor, not a theory scribbled in the margins of a fringe blog. A second, physical, monumental structure, buried under more than 100 feet of hardened sand, mirroring the Great Sphinx that has stared out over the desert for 45 centuries. Within days, the claim had racked up tens of millions of views. Tabloids ran the story as fact, podcasts lit up. And in offices across Cairo, Egyptologists who have spent their entire careers studying the Giza Plateau were left shaking their heads, because as far as they were concerned, nothing had actually been found at all. So, which is it? Is this the discovery of the century, hiding in plain sight for thousands of years? Or is it the latest chapter in a story that keeps refusing to die? Stick with me, because the deeper you go into this mystery, the stranger it gets. To understand why this claim landed with such force, you have to understand the man behind it. Filippo Biondi is not some amateur treasure hunter with a metal detector and a dream. He is a remote sensing scientist, a specialist in satellite radar with academic ties to institutions, including the University of Strathclyde. For years, he has worked alongside physicist Corrado Malanga and researcher Armando May under a project known as the Khafre Project, named after the pyramid they first set their sights on. Their tool of choice is something called synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography, a mouthful of a technique that uses satellite radar data, much of it pulled from orbiters like Italy's Cosmos SkyMed system, to detect microscopic vibrations in the ground. In theory, those tiny vibrations can be processed and layered together to build a three-dimensional picture of what lies beneath the surface, all without digging a single shovel of sand. It sounds almost like science fiction. And in 2022, the team published their method in a peer-reviewed academic journal, describing how they had used this exact technique to detect undiscovered internal structures inside the Great Pyramid itself. That publication gave the team a level of legitimacy that most fringe archaeological claims never get anywhere near. This was not a self-published PDF. This was peer review. But peer review of a method is not the same as peer review of a conclusion, and that distinction is about to matter a great deal. Biondi's credentials are not limited to pyramid research either, and that is part of why some in the scientific community have been reluctant to dismiss him outright as a fringe figure. Years before he ever pointed his radar at Giza, he was applying the same underlying technology to real-world infrastructure monitoring, including a widely cited study on the structural stability of the Mosul Dam in Iraq, one of the most dangerous dams on the planet. That work was published through legitimate engineering channels and used to help assess a genuine risk to hundreds of thousands of people living downstream. It is the kind of resume line that does not usually belong to someone chasing internet clout. And that is precisely what makes this story so difficult to file into a neat box. This is not a case of an obvious fraud dazzling a gullible public. It is a credentialed scientist applying a genuinely published method to one of the most mythologized locations on Earth, and getting results that sound almost too dramatic to be real. By 2025, the Khafre Project had turned its radar eye toward the Khafre Pyramid itself, and the claims coming out of their analysis were staggering. According to a press release the team put out in March of that year, their scans revealed 8 large cylindrical structures plunging an almost unbelievable 648 meters below the surface. On top of that, they described 5 stacked multi-level chambers clustered near the pyramid's base, all connected by geometric passageways. And running underneath the entire plateau, linking these structures together and possibly connecting all 3 major pyramids, was what they described as a tunnel system stretching roughly 2 kilometers. If true, this would mean the pyramids of Giza are sitting on top of an engineered underground city, a network so vast and so deep that it dwarfs anything ancient Egyptians are known to have built. For comparison, 648 meters is deeper than most modern skyscrapers are tall, meaning whatever the radar was allegedly picking up would sit far below any known Old Kingdom construction technique that Egyptologists currently understand. That single number is the reason so many scientists reacted with immediate suspicion rather than curiosity. Ancient Egyptian builders, for all their genius, are not known to have possessed the tools or the engineering knowledge required to excavate reliably to that kind of depth through solid bedrock 4,500 years ago. Mainstream archaeology did not exactly roll out the welcome mat for this idea, but the team pressed on. And just over a year later, they were back with an even bigger claim, one that would pull in a monument almost as famous as the pyramids themselves. This is where the second Sphinx enters the story. Biondi's team began by drawing a geometric line connecting the Khafre Pyramid to the existing Great Sphinx, tracing the exact relationship between the two structures. Then they mirrored that same line across the plateau, this time using the Great Pyramid, at the largest of the 3, as their anchor point. Where that mirrored line landed was the answer. To the northeast of the Great Pyramid, out toward the open desert, sits a mound of compacted sand roughly 108 feet high. According to Biondi, buried inside that very mound is a second Sphinx, essentially an architectural twin of the one the world already knows, facing the opposite direction, as if guarding the plateau from the other side. The radar data, he claims, shows the outline of a leonine body, vertical shafts descending into the earth nearby, and horizontal passages branching off deeper underground, some of which, he says, appear to connect back toward the original Sphinx and the Khafre Pyramid complex. Biondi has stated publicly that he is around 80% confident in the theory. That number might sound impressive on the surface, but in scientific terms, 80% confidence on a claim this seismic is nowhere near the bar required for an actual discovery. It is enough to make headlines. It is not enough to rewrite the history books, at least not yet. So why does the Sphinx of all places make for such fertile ground for a claim like this? Because, unlike almost anywhere else on the Giza Plateau, there is genuine physical evidence, carved in stone nearly 35 centuries ago, that at least raises the question of whether there was ever meant to be more than one. That evidence is called the Dream Stele. It is a massive slab of pink granite standing between the paws of the Great Sphinx, and it was placed there around 1401 BC by a young man who would go on to become one of Egypt's most consequential rulers, Pharaoh Thutmose IV. According to the inscription carved into the stele, Thutmose was still just a prince when one day, while out hunting near Giza, exhaustion overtook him and he lay down to rest in the shadow of the Sphinx, which at that point had already been half swallowed by the desert sand for generations. As he slept, the story goes, the Sphinx itself spoke to him in a dream, promising him the throne of Egypt if he would clear away the sand burying its body. Thutmose kept his end of the bargain. He excavated the Sphinx, freed it from the dunes, and not long after, the throne did indeed pass to him. It is one of the earliest recorded examples of a monument being treated as a living, speaking entity, and it is also, quietly, one of the strangest pieces of evidence in this entire mystery. Because carved into that same stele, alongside the story of the dream, are images of not one but two mythical feline guardians. For centuries, historians largely brushed this detail aside as artistic flourish or symbolic doubling. But to researchers like Biondi, it raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. If Thutmose only freed one Sphinx from the sand, what happened to the other? Some researchers have taken that question and run even further with it, most notably the Egyptian-born researcher Bassam el-Shamma, who, years before Biondi ever entered the picture, pointed to ancient Egyptian records describing a catastrophic lightning strike that shattered a Sphinx-like monument on the plateau. If that account is accurate, it would mean a second Sphinx did once exist above ground, only to be destroyed by a bolt from the sky long before anyone thought to document it properly, leaving nothing behind but scattered stone and a legend. El-Shamma's theory never gained mainstream traction either, largely for the same reason Biondi's claims struggle today. No physical fragment of a shattered second Sphinx has ever been recovered from the plateau, despite more than a century of intensive excavation in the surrounding area. But the theory has quietly persisted in Egyptological circles for years, treated less as an accepted fact and more as one of those nagging loose threads that nobody has ever managed to fully tie off. It is worth noting that a lightning strike destroying an above-ground monument and a monument being deliberately buried intact are two very different scenarios, and Biondi's radar claims actually point toward the second, an intact structure still sitting beneath the sand rather than scattered rubble. If both theories somehow turned out to be pointing at the same missing monument, that would only deepen the mystery further, because it would suggest something significant happened to it, was recorded in fragments across two very different traditions, and then was almost completely erased from formal history. And that brings us to the part of this story that has kept conspiracy theorists and treasure hunters obsessed for more than 2,000 years, long before satellite radar was ever dreamed up. The idea that something enormous, something deliberately hidden, lies underneath the Sphinx and the surrounding plateau. The first recorded whisper of this comes from the Roman era. In the 1st century AD, the Roman scholar Pliny the Elder wrote that the Sphinx was hollow inside, and that buried within it was the tomb of a forgotten king named Harmachis. No Egyptologist has ever managed to confirm the existence of a ruler by that name, but the claim tells us something important. Even 2,000 years ago, people who lived and traveled near Giza were already convinced there was more to the Sphinx than met the eye. That suspicion did not fade with time. It resurfaced centuries later in medieval Islamic legend, in stories describing a king named Surid ibn Salhuk, said to have ruled Egypt in the age before a great flood swept across the world. According to the legend, Surid did not build the pyramids as tombs at all. He built them as vaults, engineered to preserve the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization before the flood could wipe it from existence. When those medieval stories eventually made their way into European languages, they took root in the Western imagination, and by the late 19th century they had evolved into something new. In 1882, the American writer and politician Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and in it he formally reframed this ancient legend around the lost city of Atlantis, planting the seed of an idea that would eventually be given a name millions of people recognize today, the Hall of Records. That name did not truly explode into popular culture, however, until the 1930s, and it came from one of the strangest sources imaginable, an American faith healer and self-described psychic named Edgar Cayce. Cayce claimed that while in a trance state, he could see visions of the distant past, and in one of his most famous readings, he described survivors of Atlantis fleeing to the Nile Valley as their homeland sank beneath the ocean. According to Cayce, these refugees, carrying with them advanced knowledge they feared would be lost forever, buried a vast archive of records deep underground, and built a sphinx above it to seal the chamber and mark its location for future generations wise enough to find it. It is a genuinely thrilling story. It is also, and it is worth being completely honest here, built on nothing more than the trance visions of a man with no archaeological training, speaking in the 1930s. And yet that story never fully went away. It kept resurfacing in books, in documentaries, and late-night television specials, always circling back to the same unanswered question. What, if anything, is really underneath the Sphinx? Which brings us squarely back to 2026 and to Filippo Biondi standing in front of that room in Bologna. Because if his theory is right, the legend and the radar data are finally converging. The second Sphinx would not simply be a decorative twin, it would be the entrance, the gateway to whatever lies beneath, a physical anchor point for a myth that has survived for 2,000 years. Naturally, this is where mainstream Egyptology draws a very hard line, and it is worth walking through exactly why, because the objections are more specific than simple gatekeeping. The most vocal critic has been Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities and arguably the most recognizable Egyptologist alive today. Hawass has flatly described the underground megastructure claims as a fabrication with no scientific foundation whatsoever. His argument is not just about skepticism for its own sake, it is about logic. The area around the Sphinx and the pyramids has been studied, mapped, surveyed, and excavated more thoroughly than almost any other archaeological site on the planet for well over a century. If there were credible evidence of a second monumental structure sitting just beneath the surface, Hawass argues, Egyptian and international archaeologists would have every incentive imaginable to go looking for it immediately. A discovery like that would be a career-defining, headline-generating, funding-attracting triumph. There is no institutional motive to bury such a find, pun fully intended. And yet, as of now, Egyptian antiquities authorities have confirmed no such discovery, and no excavation permit has been granted to physically investigate the mound Biondi has identified. Biondi's team has, according to their own statements, submitted a formal proposal requesting permission for exactly that kind of on-site geological investigation. Whether Egyptian authorities grant it remains to be seen. Then there is the deeper, more technical objection, and this one comes from geophysicists rather than archaeologists. Conventional ground-penetrating radar, the kind used in countless legitimate archaeological surveys around the world, is only capable of detecting features a few feet beneath the surface, and even that depends heavily on soil composition. Dense limestone bedrock, the exact material the Giza Plateau is built on, is notoriously difficult for radar to penetrate at all. Critics argue that there is no established radar or satellite technology capable of reliably imaging carved structures, buried dozens or even hundreds of feet beneath solid limestone, which is precisely the depth Biondi's more extreme claims describe. Biondi's response to this criticism centers on the specifics of his method, synthetic aperture radar. Doppler tomography, he argues, does not work like traditional ground-penetrating radar at all. Instead of bouncing a signal straight down and measuring the return, it uses satellite data collected over time to detect extremely subtle vibrations in the earth, essentially treating the ground itself as something closer to a slowly resonating structure and reconstructing its internal geometry from those micro-movements. It is a genuinely novel approach, and defenders of the project point out, correctly, that the underlying methodology was published in a peer-reviewed journal back in 2022, meaning it has technically cleared one of science's most important hurdles. But here is where the story takes its most contentious turn, and it is a detail that even sympathetic observers acknowledge is a real problem. While Biondi's team uses raw satellite data that is publicly accessible to anyone, the actual processing algorithm, the specific software that transforms that raw data into the detailed three-dimensional images the public has seen, is kept entirely proprietary. Biondi has filed international patents protecting his specific method for extracting these underground images, and platforms built to run his analysis are explicitly designed to prevent outside access to the underlying code. From a business and intellectual property standpoint, that is understandable. Years of research went into building this tool, and Biondi has every right to protect it. But from a scientific standpoint, it creates a serious credibility gap. Independent researchers cannot take his raw data, run it through their own version of the algorithm, and check whether the results hold up. They are left in the position of trusting the process without being able to verify it themselves. And in a field already primed for sensational claims after decades of pseudo-archaeological specials promising secret chambers and lost civilizations, that lack of transparency is exactly the kind of gap that skeptics walk straight through. Supporters of the project push back hard on this framing. They point out that Biondi has 3 decades of experience working in radar laboratories, that his team brought in artificial intelligence as an independent secondary check specifically to rule out pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to see meaningful shapes, like a face or a familiar silhouette, in random noise. They argue that dismissing the work outright without a single test excavation ever being attempted is its own kind of bias, one dressed up as scientific caution, but functioning more like reflexive gatekeeping. It is worth sitting with both sides of that tension for a moment, because neither position is unreasonable on its face. Extraordinary claims really do require extraordinary evidence. But refusing to even test a claim, when testing it would be relatively straightforward, is also a strange way to practice science. So where does that leave us right now in the aftermath of the Bologna announcement? The honest answer is suspended in uncertainty, which, frustratingly, is exactly where this mystery has sat for the better part of 2,000 years. What we know for certain is this. The Dream Stele really does depict 2 feline guardians, not one, and that detail has never been fully explained by mainstream Egyptology beyond calling it artistic symmetry. We know that Filippo Biondi is a credentialed radar scientist with a genuine peer-reviewed publication behind his methodology, not a random internet personality pulling claims out of thin air. We know that his team has identified a specific, physical, geographically precise location on the Giza Plateau, a mound roughly 108 feet high, and has formally requested permission to dig there. And we know that if Egyptian authorities grant that permission, and if a team puts shovels, or more likely careful, painstaking archaeological tools, into that exact mound, this entire debate gets settled in a matter of weeks. Not years, not decades. Weeks. That is the part of this story that should genuinely keep you up at night, in the best possible way. Unlike so many ancient mysteries that can never truly be resolved because the evidence rotted away millennia ago, this one has an actual physical testable answer sitting under a specific pile of sand right now, waiting. And if Biondi is wrong, if the mound turns out to be nothing more than a naturally formed dune with no monument hidden inside it at all, that will not be the end of the story either, because the legend of something vast and deliberately concealed beneath the Giza Plateau has survived Roman historians, medieval scholars, 19th century writers, and a trance-channeling psychic from the 1930s. It has outlasted every single person who ever tried to debunk it completely. Whatever radar imagery says or does not say about that particular mound of sand, the deeper hunger driving this story, the desire to believe that ancient civilizations left something enormous and deliberate buried just out of reach, is not going anywhere. It has already survived 2,000 years of skepticism. It will likely survive this controversy too, whichever way the sand eventually settles. What is different this time, and this is worth sitting with before we close this out, is that we finally have a named claimant, a specific coordinate, a testable location, and a formal request for excavation sitting on the desks of Egyptian antiquities officials. Every other version of this legend, from Pliny the Elder's hollow tomb to Edgar Cayce's Atlantean archive, was permanently unfalsifiable. Nobody could point to a map and say, dig exactly here. Biondi, for all the controversy swirling around his methods and his refusal to open source his algorithm, has done exactly that. He has drawn a line on a map and staked his professional reputation on what lies beneath it. That alone makes this moment different from every Hall of Records rumor that came before it. Somewhere in Cairo, a permit application is sitting on a desk, waiting for a signature that could either make Filippo Biondi one of the most consequential archaeological figures of this century, or quietly close the book on a controversy that has already made global headlines for months. Either way, the desert keeps its secrets a little longer, at least until someone finally puts a shovel in exactly the right spot. So here is the real question the story leaves behind, long after the headlines fade and the podcast clips stop circulating. If ancient Egyptians really did build a second Sphinx, deliberately positioned as a mirror to the first, what were they actually trying to protect? Was it a king's forgotten tomb, echoing Pliny the Elder's 2,000-year-old claim? Was it a repository of knowledge, the way medieval legend and Edgar Cayce both separately imagined, centuries apart from one another, without any obvious connection between their stories? Or is the far more mundane explanation, the correct one, that this is simply a pile of ancient sand shaped by wind and time into a coincidence that radar imaging is now misreading as intention? The Great Pyramid took thousands of workers and decades of relentless labor to construct. If a second Sphinx really is down there, whoever built it did not do so by accident. Structures on that scale do not happen by chance. They happen because someone, 4,500 years ago, decided something needed to be built, buried, and protected, badly enough to justify moving that much stone and sand in the first place. Consider the scale of what is already confirmed. The known Great Sphinx alone stretches roughly 240 feet from paw to tail and rises about 66 feet above the plateau, carved directly out of a single ridge of bedrock limestone by workers using little more than copper tools and raw determination. It is one of the largest monolithic statues ever created by human hands, and it has already spent most of its existence, partially or fully buried, rediscovered and reburied by the desert again and again across the centuries, long before Thutmose ever cleared it the first time. If the ancient Egyptians were willing to carve one structure of that magnitude and then simply let the sand reclaim it for generations at a stretch, the idea of a second sister structure disappearing beneath the dunes for 4.5 millennia stops sounding quite so far-fetched, even if the radar evidence supporting it remains unproven. Until an excavation permit is granted and a team actually breaks ground on that mound, every answer to that question remains exactly what it has always been for the last 2,000 years. An educated guess dressed up as certainty, waiting for the desert to finally decide whether it is ready to give up its secret. Which theory do you find more convincing? That there truly is a second Sphinx buried beneath the Giza Plateau, or that this is history repeating an old legend with new technology attached to it? Let me know what you think, and stick around, because this story is far from finished. Whatever is or is not buried out there in that 100-foot mound of sand, one thing is certain. The Giza Plateau still has not finished surprising us, and it may never truly be done.